That would be great. Well, thank you very much, Mayor, members of the council. It is great to be with you this morning. My name is Michelle Ferguson, and I am with the Novak Consulting Group, a part of Raftellus. With me today are several of the team members who participated in the organizational scan, including Jonathan Ingram, Rebecca Hoskin, Kelsey Engelking, and Jennifer Teal. And we will be, if it's all right with you, Brian, sharing our screen. We have a presentation that we would like to go through for the council today.
That'll work. And we have you guys, just as an FYI, we give till about 12:30. So.
Well, we promised to go over all of the high points. I think, Jonathan, you're sharing the notes view right now. We will go over the high points of the organizational scan, but are certainly very interested in making sure that we allow time for conversation and questions that any of you have. And while Jonathan is doing that, I will just go ahead and get started. What we want to do this morning, it's afternoon for me. I'm East Coast, so I'm going to remember you all are morning, hence the coffee. So I'll remember that. We are going to talk a little bit about the project purpose and approach that we went through for this organizational scan and review some of the key findings and key recommendations that were part of the scan. And then, as I said before, certainly make sure that we open it up for conversation. I've already introduced the folks on our team that are here. There were a total of 5 of us that were involved from our firm in the scan, and you'll hear from a number of them today as we go through the presentation. So in terms of the project purpose itself, I think most of you know this. We had an opportunity to speak with each of you at some point during this process. And really, the organizational scan, the purpose of the scan itself was really to help identify what are some of the important key areas of focus for the organization. Certainly with the growing community that you are, knowing that there has been a lot of change and development within the community, and certainly change and development within the organization as well too. Not the least of which is a new city administrator. This is a perfect time to take a high-level look at the organization and really identify, given where you intend to go and grow, what are some of the key focus areas that the organization needs to be paying attention to. And so you'll see on the screen there several of the key areas that we paid attention to as we were working through this process with the organization, really looking at operations. We looked at high-level staffing related issues. While this wasn't a detailed deep dive into operations and staffing, there are certainly some important lessons learned from what we heard and what we learned during the process that we think are going to really be important as you all think about future budget considerations as well as organizational changes, and when you think about service levels as well too for the organization. So in terms of the approach, things that we have done that led to the report that you have today, we started by working with the leadership team. We believe it's important to start by talking with the key leaders within the organization, and that also included individual conversations with each of the council members. We operated fully in a virtual environment, and many of us, myself included, were very disappointed that we weren't able to make it out to Camas because you all spoke so highly of Camas. You are great salespersons for your community. We hope next time when conditions are different that we will definitely come through the community because like I said, you all are great salespersons. So we did a number of virtual interviews with staff throughout the organization, and we tried to talk with people in each of the departments and at different levels within the department, because we believe it's important not just to talk to those at the top, but those throughout the organization to really understand the perspective of different employees throughout the the organization. The city was great. I know we pestered them a lot with the requests for information and data. We develop our recommendations not solely based on the conversations we have, but also on the analysis of the data that's available, as well as best practices for similar communities. While all communities are unique, there's certainly an opportunity to learn about best practices through what other communities have done successfully. And all of that resulted in the organizational scan that you have before you today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jonathan Ingram, who's going to walk through an overview of the recommendations that you have in the scan.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and it's very good to be with you all today. And I'll echo what Michelle said. I'm kind of a Lewis and Clark aficionado, so the missed opportunity to see the Columbia River Gorge is really kind of heartbreaking for me. So, we'll go through each of the kind of key recommendations in the departments, and I just want to keep this a little bit conversational, really just to talk about just some of the context around some of the observations that we made. But at a high level, just a couple of things to point out. You all have a pretty rich organization and a lot of great opportunities to build upon. Obviously, as a growing community, that brings a lot of advantage. It's an attractive place, to live, very high quality of life. We were very impressed, really, in the conversations that we had throughout this process. Sort of staff longevity and experience. People don't really leave the organization, right? So it's a place that people want to work. Very high commitment to the service level expectations that you all expect. And honestly, that's really an important point, I think, that permeates throughout the work that we've done. That commitment to service level has generated some anxiety because your departments, in many cases, are dealing with the growth that you all are experiencing and trying to maintain what they consider to be, a best-in-class level of service. And how do you do that as the workload changes, right? So that's a kind of a key area. That customer focus, permeated throughout, really in each of the departments that we spoke with. So, just some very, very strong foundation to build upon. And, one of the things that we want to emphasize is, the whole point of this process is to sort of identify areas to focus on in the spirit of continuous improvement. But there are also a lot of very good things that you all have done as an organization and as a governing body to really advance the interests of the community and advance the interests of the organization. But like I said, this is not, a study sort of designed to clarify opportunities. And the biggest issue, and this really isn't going to be a surprise to you all, right? That growth that you all have experienced and that you will continue to experience, constrains the organization's ability to meet service level expectations. What we often see in these kind of environments, and I think it's been true in Camas, is the organization strains under that growth. You have systems that are largely designed for a smaller community, and sometimes it takes a while to catch those systems up to reflect, really the new demands on the organization. So we're really focused in on trying to help you build that internal capacity. Organizational communication and strategic planning. This is a common issue, right? So how do you integrate sort of high-level policy considerations with the day-to-day work of the organization? How do you make sure that key players, staff, sort of the executive team with the city, the governing body, how do you work together collaboratively to make sure that everyone is on the same page and that there's opportunities to really build and strengthen relationships and leverage those relationships to the benefit of your community. Management and support services. The internal service functions are areas where we see some real opportunities, and we view we kind of have a bias at the Novak Consulting Group and at Raftellus. We view internal services, through a very specific lens that we want them to be strategic partners to help deliver service. Certainly, they have a control function, right? There's a responsibility for finance, HR, IT to serve as gatekeepers to some degree, but we also really want them to support the delivery of service and to be partners to those operating departments who are out there kind of on the front line. And we do see some operations, staffing, and service level, integration questions and issues that are really linked up to that growth. So, just big picture, there's one of the things that we, really want to drive home is there's some opportunity to strengthen some of that governing and staff relationships as we go forward. With a new mayor, a new city administrator, several new council members, right? Relatively new council members. You're in a really good position to sort of define what the process of working together looks like, and you have some really great opportunities to be able to very intentionally do that. Your strategic plan was really designed to last through 2020, so you're ripe for an update, and that update process can really be valuable in terms of helping clarify what are those governing priorities and how do those governing priorities how do they get translated into sort of service delivery, right? So we've teed up some opportunities in that space to really not just chart a strategic path, but also strengthen relationships within the government. And the performance management system also sort of supports that piece. So when we say performance management system, a lot of times what people hear is employee performance reviews, and that's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about are the plans and the processes that ensure that the work of an organization goes forward, is measured, and that adjustments are made to really reflect, again, that strategic goal. So what's the process internally within the city, within kind of at the staff level, to identify issues, to communicate and collaborate among staff, but also to collaborate and communicate sort of up through the organization and up to the governing body and vice versa, right? So we've laid out some key best practices with respect to performance management systems, how to integrate that into your strategic planning process, and really be able to move forward in a positive way in that space. The other piece, relates to the communications director. So that communications piece, you all, you have a relatively new hire. As was alluded to earlier in our conversation, you're really building a communications plan that supports that broader goal in terms of aligning council priorities and department work plans, as well as the goals and expectations of the mayor. In your particular form of government, there are different roles and responsibilities, and each deserves a place at the table, right? So, we want to create some structure that helps you all move in that direction. In terms of workforce, this is where we are talking about employee performance reviews. So as we talk about internal services and internal processes that go to support the work of an organization, this is one of those areas that needs to evolve a bit to reflect the expanded scope of your community and of your organization. So right now, your departments, many of them are conducting employee performance reviews, but they're all happening in different formats and with different priorities. So certainly there are good reasons to have very specific, department-specific, technical type things reflected in the review process and the performance review process. But you also want to generate some consistency so that there is equity across the organization, especially as you grow. So some best practices to recommend it in that space. Related to that, there's a need to develop some workforce development and succession planning processes. This could mean looking at different levels of the organization in terms of what middle management type positions may you need to create at some point through reclassification or through the development of new positions to be able to generate a pool who can step into leadership positions as long-time employees start to retire. But succession planning really isn't only about the management level of the organization, right? It's also about the supervisory level. That's just as important from a service delivery perspective. In terms of financial management, that financial management and budgeting piece, that's really an area where we see some opportunities to enhance the transparency of the budget development process, both kind of internally within the organization, but also externally. So we've made some recommendations about sort of how the budget process can be revised and realigned to really generate some clarity on the part of departments and to create a more collaborative process. And we think you all are in a good position to start to craft your budget delivery, your budget message, your budget document to really meet some best practices and sort of what that looks like to be transparent with the governing body, be transparent with the community. The Governance Finance Officers Association has a really great program, and it is labor intensive to really develop a budget document that sort of meets their standards. But there's an opportunity. I think you all are in a good position to start to move toward that and really improve your budget presentation, your budget transparency going forward. So in terms of internal support services, again, This is, again, one of those big areas where the internal workings of those support functions are really, very critical to the organization. We've identified a lot of tasks. We've really made a number of recommendations about improving some of those internal services, duties. And one of the things we want to be clear about is all of the recommendations that we're making, and all of those recommendations are in addition to full-time work. Right. So we really don't believe that there's really sufficient capacity to really tackle some of those issues going forward. So, developing an additional position will help with some span of control issues also with the city at the city administrator level. But creating an assistant city administrator who oversees really an internal services portfolio, provides that dedicated function, provides some special project management expertise, which can really, help advance the organization on the internal services side. In terms of staffing levels and internal services functions, a couple of key areas. HR has really very limited capacity. This is an area that you all will want to pay attention to in terms of adding personnel. The typical ratio is, you want an average of one, there's a kind of rule of thumb, an average of one HR professional per 100 employees. You're not there. So there's really some need to generate some additional capacity there, especially, again, to tackle some of these initiatives that we've outlined. Risk management currently housed in the police department. So that's a relatively unusual model, but I think it's a common model in Washington. We don't see it very much, but as you start to build capacity on the internal services side, consider potentially shifting that risk management focus, because it's really about financial management, risk management, and employee safety. That's really a major element of risk management. So incorporating that in some HR and finance capacity, there may be some opportunity for that going forward. And then the IT system expansion. You all are looking at developing a new ERP system. So building some capacity there to support those service delivery initiatives, I think, will be important as well. So just a couple of other key recommendations, again, sort of justification on some of the staffing recommendations. So one of the areas that we've identified, as a potential area to look at is the need to potentially develop a class and comp study update. This process was done relatively recently, so you're all going to have to weigh whether you want to make that investment at this point. But the job growth in the area is really driving some competition issues. Part of our scope in terms of the scan was to have conversations about how departments are feeling in terms of their ability to recruit and attract and retain folks. There may be some issues there worth exploring, so just something to consider going forward. There's also some need to do some updates on the internal services policy. So again, those key support functions, those strategic partnerships. So we see some space to develop some additional projects in that area. The other, kind of major area, I think, on the IT side, and this will require some dedicated staffing commitment, is to develop a really intentional IT governance infrastructure. So right now, sort of the way it works is departments generally will identify the business specific applications that they need, and we'll move forward and implement those. That can be a good thing. So but there's also a need to really go through a process of collaboratively making decisions about what IT infrastructure the city invests in, achieving standardization where it is operationally reasonable to do so. So standardization is not always the be all end all, but it is important from a workload management perspective. So creating some standardization is important. Creating space for business for operating departments to be able to identify those very unique business specific applications that they need, but want to be really intentional about making decisions about where you invest IT funds going forward. And then that ties a little bit into the ERP implementation process. So you all are teeing up the replacement of your finance HR, your finance and HR systems in the near term. We want to really include IT in those conversations. So developing some collaborative work groups among key operating departments as well as your key internal services departments to really set up a project team that can drive that process going forward. That'll really add some value in terms of strengthening those relationships and making sure that the outcome is useful and is as free of bugs as it can possibly be. And I will tell you, there will be bugs. So, having gone through a few my haircut is primarily due to an ERP implementation, by the way. So there's there will be some challenges there. So we'll need to develop a strong internal team to support that work. On the community and economic development side, this is an area we saw a lot of good things in the community economic development department. You all are dealing with really aggressive development, right? In terms of, and that really drives and impacts their workload, and it's significant. One area where we, again, do see an opportunity for collaboration. Are you guys picking up on the collaboration theme? I think you are. But, you all were part of a regional economic development association that disbanded in mid-2020. You all have budgeted, I think thoughtfully budgeted for an economic development director position to come in, but it'll still be one position, right? And there are all sorts of departments, finance, community and economic development, public works, your utilities. There are all sorts of departments that will have some role to play and some really critical input in terms of how you focus your economic development strategies going forward. Creating a multidisciplinary team to really develop and execute a strategy and really integrate, your all's goals as a governing body and the mayor's goals from an executive management perspective. There's a good opportunity there as well. On the public works side, we spent a lot of time looking at the work that Public Works has done to date, and I would say they've really done a great job of implementing many best practices with respect to asset management. And I think this is an important thing that I just want to emphasize because it's really not that common. One of the things that we run across very often is that public works departments tend to be pretty far behind on the asset management best practices scale, right? But your public works director has and the staff within public works have really done a good job of beginning to implement key characteristics of sound asset management within the constraints that they have available. So what we've really done is just sort of teed up priority next steps for them, and it really carries and builds on a lot of the very good work that they have done. And just for your all's perspective, what sound asset management is really about. It's about maximizing the useful life of all your assets. Could be parks, roads, water and sewer infrastructure. And there's some clear processes that you can execute to really focus the effort of your maintenance crews and focus your capital investments to meet that objective. Infrastructure condition assessments, that's part of it. You all have gone through a pavement condition assessment process that's in very good shape and can be used to build items going forward, or build plans going forward. But there is some need to focus on the utility side a bit in terms of what are the conditions of those assets and what's the best process going forward. Enhancing work order system utilization. This is really going to be a big area and a big opportunity in public works. Right now, they do a good job of managing with the systems that they have, but they're really using customer resource management systems to track service requests. And it doesn't really give them the capacity to sort of preload preventive work plans that really maximize those asset management best practices. And that's really what you want to focus on. You really want to try to dedicate most of your staff's energy toward preventive work and really limit the reactive work and kind of the putting out fires where you can. Certainly there are going to be things that you just have to respond to and you have to address, and you have to build that capacity into your staffing structure, right? But the focus always ought to be on that preventive work, and that's really the underlying theme of our recommendations. Now, the work that has to be done in this space is going to require some dedicated effort from engineering, okay? Right now, the city engineer is split between public works and community and economic development. With these recommendations on asset management and the need to build some additional systems and really integrate those infrastructure condition assessments with operations work planning, with kind of a nitty gritty of the day-to-day decision about where you send crews and what they do, we really need some additional engineering focus there. So we made some recommendations to sort of fully assign the engineer to the public works side of the house, but to also add additional capacity to take on and manage that engineering plan review workload. There are all kinds of different ways that you can do that via contract. You can add personnel. You can add personnel and house them in community and economic development as embedded employees, right, who are focusing on that plan review piece. But there's a real need to focus on those asset management buckets as well. In terms of staffing issues on the public works side, there are a few areas where, there appear to be a pretty clear need for additional personnel. Facilities management and maintenance was really one of the main areas. And this ties into some of the, you essentially have one person who's responsible for maintaining all of the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing infrastructure associated with 18 facilities, right? That's not a sufficient staffing load. There's a lot of contract arrangements that are in place, but some additional resources there are really necessary to handle just the day-to-day items and also potentially some additional contract management work. Water, sewer, collection, conveyance, and distribution crew design. So one of the things that happens as a community grows is usually in smaller communities, you have generalist crews. You have crews who do a little bit of everything. They're Jacks and Janes of all trades, right? And that's really how the deployment model on the water and sewer side is designed. Water, sewer, storm water, a little bit of everything sort of rolled in. There seems to be a pretty clear need to create some specialization to generate efficiency. What that looks like, there are a lot of options that you all can explore, but it's definitely an area for further research going forward. And then the administrative support piece, and again, this ties into some of the asset management related recommendations. We expect some data management duties that are going to come out of, as you generate work order systems, you have access to all this really great data that can help you all determine how well are we doing and what adjustments do we need to make going forward. But you need people to manage that data, especially help to manage that work order process so that your skilled labor crews, right, are dedicated to those functions and not administrative tasks behind a computer logging data, right? So again, it's just pairing the work with the right people, and we see a need to generate some administrative or analytical capacity on the public works and utility side. And then it's just about service standards. So the other sort of great thing about the work order system, the asset management approach, is it really helps clarify what are our current service standards and what are the benchmarks that we are going to measure ourselves against going forward. And that gives you the data and the indicators that you need to say, it's time for us to add additional personnel as we add, 200 linear lane miles of road, or, depending different pipes that, water and sewer infrastructure. There's just, you can develop some metrics from the system that give you good indicators of when it's time to make those additional investments in personnel. On the Parks and Rec side, we took a look, very closely at the organizational location of parks maintenance. Okay, you all have really expanded your park inventory over the past just over the past few years, not to mention the past 10. So, there are clear staffing needs on the park maintenance side. So I just want to be, very clear about that's the case, and if there's a need to make some investments in that area. The location of park maintenance is a little bit more difficult question to wrestle with. So what we have done is sort of identify the pros and cons with different locations in terms of organizationally. Right now, it's organized under Public Works, and there are benefits to this arrangement. In that there's access to other crews if necessary. There's greater resource sharing. There's a larger management pool, and we're talking about adding analytical capacity. That capacity then can support some of these park maintenance operations. And there's some very good service standards that are in place, but you really need to sort of analyze the data to evaluate how you all are doing compared to those sort of service standards. So you need that management support, that sort of administrative support capacity. The Parks and Rec department is staffed with basically about 2.8 FTE, right? So, very, very low staff, not a whole lot of capacity to take on some of those additional administrative roles. The location of the park maintenance crews could be a challenge in terms of transferring them over. The real benefit of having the park maintenance function under recreation is the integration of parks as the resources, as the places where recreation programming happens. So the real value of it is making sure that recreation and parks are really kind of tied together in the same goal. Okay, that can be a challenge to having having the park maintenance function on the public works side. But that challenge can be overcome and has been traditionally overcome by maintaining really strong relationships between the two department directors, right? So that has historically been the case, but you'll have a new Parks and Rec director coming in if they have not started already. There can be challenges to having organizational outcomes sort of linked to strictly to relationships, not just to the organizational design. So we've laid out some pros and cons associated with both approaches. Both can work and both have worked really well. So there isn't really a clear best practice one way or the other. This is one of those areas where you all have to make an assessment based on your individual limitations and individual expectations for what you're looking for. In terms of law enforcement, just if you take one law enforcement recommendation away, I would say it would be the supervisory recommendation. So, one of the things that we do really all over the country is we do police and police staffing studies and organizational assessments, and supervision is critical in modern policing. Just the era of policing that we are in, the high risk associated with with policing issues in the country. You all are fortunate in that you have a very low crime rate. You have a very engaged police department. At least that's what we've derived from our conversations. Very strong relationships in the community with law enforcement. But making sure that there's 24-hour supervisory coverage through both the addition of sergeant positions, as well as the development and formalization of an officer in charge program, so that there's clear supervisory lines of authority when sergeants are on leave, will be an important recommendation going forward to execute. The other area that I think is important to tee up, and I would tie this a little bit with the sergeant recommendation. So, right now the patrol group works on a variation of a 10-hour schedule. There's all kinds of advantages to a 10-hour schedule. There are overlap periods and an overlap day. It really provides great opportunity for training. It essentially doubles the size of your police force on a given day, on that overlap day. Provides the opportunity for folks to take leave without necessarily driving up overtime costs. So there's some advantages to it. But it also tends to be more expensive to staff. You usually need more personnel to staff a 10-hour than you do an 8-hour or a 12-hour, especially a 12-hour variation. The 8-hour and the 12-hour shifts have different advantages and disadvantages as well. There's pros and cons from an officer experience and from a city cost perspective. And one ought not to outweigh the other, right? It may be that the current schedule is the right schedule for your community, but we've recommended some comparative assessment just to really do a cost benefit of what is it really costing us to maintain the schedule, what are the options, and what options specifically would the police officers be open to engaging with. So we want that to be a collaborative process, just to maintain really the strong relationships that exist in that space. The other area that we've teed up on the law enforcement side relates to specialization. So the police department, I think, has done a really great job of taking advantage of regional services and special services at the county level to really support law enforcement operations. Forensic investigations, computer forensic investigations, cell phone sort of technical skill sets associated with pulling evidence. They should continue to do that. That's a good practice, and it's not something that we would recommend moving away from. But there is some space to create a little bit of specialization on the patrol side, especially. Some traffic specialization, given the high priority of traffic issues in your community, according to surveys. Potentially some other specializations. And the benefit of these is it creates some additional capacity in-house without necessarily creating additional units, right? So you're not adding personnel, you're providing some additional bandwidth and some additional specialization among existing patrol staff who take on some additional duties. There are training periods that will pull them away from their normal shift, so that'll impact a little bit your overtime numbers. So just to kind of be clear about that. But it also creates some really great professional development opportunities. In a smaller department, it can be hard for police officers to feel like they have a career path and an opportunity to really develop their skill set. And creating some of these special functions will provide some space to do that. But again, just to emphasize, it'll also be really important to just continue to leverage those regional relationships that your chief has done in the past. On the fire side, we took a look. We really read in detail the fire department master plan that was developed in 2019, and I don't really have anything bad to say about it. I think it was very well done. I think we really validated the recommendations. So at the risk of repeating them, I would say it's a good path forward. It's just always, of course, as you all know, a question of funding. How do you go about prioritizing and funding those recommendations? We also took, just a very hard look at the cost share model, and we, associated with the cost share model with Washougal. We did some best practice research and just tried to identify some other models that exist at the fire department in the fire department space. And, generally we found that the model that is sort of the cost share agreement that's outlined, or the cost share methodology that's outlined in the agreement is really about as equitable as it can be in terms of the buckets of information that you all are paying attention to. We made a couple of recommendations just about, how you go about updating those cost share agreements. But really, just want to validate that that's legit. It's a legitimate, arrangement, and just made some recommendations again as to how to adjust them to reflect changes in workload and changes in population dynamics. There's also some opportunity to really put the fire department's impact fee program revisions that's current on the fast track. There's really an opportunity to generate some additional revenue to potentially support some of the major capital investments that come with expanding fire services. Fire trucks are expensive, as you all know. It's very expensive to add infrastructure on the fire side. So that's really a priority area. The other sort of focus that we looked at was on the fire prevention side. The plan review work, whenever there's a new development or a new housing, housing development that's being moved through the city's process, that draws a lot of attention from your fire prevention staff. That's a time-sensitive effort. It requires dedicated attention to turn it around very quickly. And that time-sensitive element of plan review and new construction inspection, right? That time-sensitive element draws attention away from existing occupancy inspections. And that existing occupancy inspection process is just as important from a fire prevention perspective. So we've made some recommendations potentially about adding some, really clearly identifying what your service level expectations are on that side, using a risk-based approach, and generating some additional capacity potentially through contracting to take on some plan review and inspection workload to make sure that your fire marshal type positions, your fire inspectors are able to get out and do that work. And at the same time, we'd like to see some enhancements in the fire pre-planning process. So the pre-plan process is essentially your fire companies, your EMS personnel will go into existing occupancies, high risk occupancies, and they'll develop a fire plan so that they have essentially a schematic, a layout of the occupancy, and a basic approach to how they would go about fighting that fire in the event that a fire occurred in that location. It really is a best practice in the fire service, and we'd like to see some additional focus there. But it will be hard to do that, as you all are balancing the EMS workload that you're tasked with. So, but those are really the priority areas on the fire and EMS side. So those are, the big buckets of recommendations and just some of the context associated with what we were looking at. As we sort of move, past the assessment process and start to track what implementation looks like, there's a couple things that we like to emphasize as we do this work. One, these recommendations represent new work for the organization. So you have folks who are already working full-time plus jobs, who are trying their best to manage service delivery. And these are going to be new projects on top of that. They are important, but they will take time to implement. That's just the nature of this work. So being very intentional and thoughtful about how you craft the implementation plan. 5 years is not an unreasonable time frame to move through some of these major initiatives, especially as many of them involve additional study. And the other thing that we want to emphasize is, as you all move forward in this process, this recommendations may fall off the table, right? environmental conditions change, priorities change. It's completely okay to use this as a starting point to move forward with a clear plan, but also to continuously evaluate where you're at and where you want to go and to make adjustments going forward. So what's important is that process is collaborative, that there's a clear implementation plan going forward, and that you all work together to improve the service delivery in the community and the relationships that exist between council, between the mayor, as well as staff. With that, open it up to any questions and comments, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Jonathan, this is Greg.
Hi, Greg.
How you doing?
I'm doing well.
So, kind of an overall question, and I don't want to assume. In your executive summary document that was shared with us prior to this PowerPoint, it indicates that this is a prioritized list, but yet at the same time, it's grouped by functional area or functional process. So I'm trying to figure out, are you saying that it is in priority order, or it's grouped by work section and then prioritized within that?
We apologize for the confusion there. So, the idea behind the scan process is that there are all sorts of things that you could be doing in the organization. And there, if this were, but these are the recommendations that we see as the priority recommendations going forward, the things to focus on from an initiative perspective. So it's not that 1 through 20 is the priority order. It's that these are the big buckets that you should prioritize.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification because I got a little sideways with it. Thank you.
Hi, Jonathan. Hello. This is Bonnie. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the scan. It was very informative and gave us some direction. One of the overarching things that I thought was missed was communication and how we can best facilitate plans in our organization. As Ellen had mentioned during the previous presentation that I don't know if you were privy to or not, but communication amongst the organization as well as out to our community, and then hearing our community is pretty fractured right now. And so I was a little surprised to hear that there wasn't any strong recommendations in this report. Do you have any?
So I'll jump in there and highlight a couple of things. I think one, part of the first recommendation, again, not the priority order, but one of the many priorities about developing a strategic plan, I think is what we typically see in local government strategic planning right now, is that there is often a key need for community engagement. And obviously community engagement looks very different based on the particular needs of a community. And so I would imagine, without presupposing what a new strategic plan would look like, but you may have specific elements within a strategic plan that outline this council and this administration's goals as it relates to community engagement, which to me is really communication. How do you, as an organization, as a body, communicate effectively and get input from and engage with the community? So I could definitely see that as being part of the strategic planning process. And there's also a recommendation in there about developing a communications needs assessment. And I think part of that needs assessment is really would help inform the specific priorities that you would have in a strategic plan as it relates to how to communicate with the public. I think there's another piece of that too, which isn't just about communicating externally, but it's the internal communication. I think a key element of a strategic planning process that would happen between the council alongside with the administration is really understanding how the council and the administration is going to communicate with each other, and also how you both as bodies are going to communicate effectively with the staff. And so I think that is an important outgrowth of a strategic planning process, is really kind of that umbrella of the functional relationships between the different bodies. So I would say, while we didn't specifically say target specific recommendations about how to communicate, I think those are very much embedded in those first 3 recommendations in the report.
Thank you. Having Brian newly on board, I was hoping that there was more structure to give to him as we grow that communication policy and procedures.
Well, and you all have certainly experienced this, like every other organization across the country in this past year. Communication looks very different, both internally and externally. And so the tools that we use to effectively communicate with each other, as well as with our constituents, really have to continue to evolve. I mean, the expectations have ratcheted up, they will continue to ratchet up. And the tools that we use to do that effectively are going to have to be flexible and change as the needs of our communities change.
Yeah, I would just add in very quickly that we are, from what I know, the IT department has already been talking with people from Bang the Table, which is a great community engagement tool, which I'm sure you guys have seen in your consulting work with other cities, was something that was very prominent that we used in Boulder, and so extremely important for community engagement.
Yeah. We see Bang the Table all the time. We partner with them a lot when we're doing strategic planning, actually, because it's really not just it's a virtual conversation is the way I like to think of it. It's not just a one-way communication tool, but it's really how to have conversations virtually with your community.
I have a couple questions and comments, if I may, please. Don Cheney. First of all, I want to comment on Bonnie's thing. I think if I could comment on just recent history, I agree with Connie that it feels like we've been a little fractured, but it may be the product somewhat of the COVID, and it may be a product of just all the new faces that we're trying to arrange and how we function. But I believe strongly that we have to fix the internal communications before we go out too publicly, just for the sake of having confidence and respect for one another in a way to communicate in common views and grounding and purpose. So I think that's an area we need attention to. I shared that with Mayor yesterday. I appreciated the fact that Mayor is already on it, because he called me, and I trust he called others regarding that very topic. Communication is key, but we need to start internally. That's my view. A question for the consultants. This is a curiosity. I'm not intending to be critical, but on page 9, table 4, general fund expenditures by categories, fiscal year 16 through 20. My question is, why are public works and fire EMS general funding not included in that comparison?
I'll have to go back and take a look at that. I will say one of the underlying recommendations associated with the budget document and the presentation piece is to sort of create some clarity around how you present those budget numbers. We pulled this information from budget documents essentially as it was illustrated, but we'll double check that, just make sure that that's accurate, that we didn't leave something out, and if we need to, we'll make a quick revision and send you all a revised version.
Again, my question was more out of curiosity.
Oh, sure. No, that's fair. Absolutely.
Critical. Yeah, but I did notice that, and I think one of our others did as well. I want to bring to the surface one topic in terms of, in reference page 23, recommendation number 11. It says ensure that all internal policies and procedures are updated, communicated to staff, and enforced. The one that I think is important that we started a couple of years ago, and I'm just bringing it to the surface because I don't even know if Jamal and Barry have been engaged in this, or even Ellen. We started a review and improvement to our emergency management plan, and that was intended to be digitized in a fashion that countywide there's an effort to start that happening, and it stopped midstream. Doesn't matter why. I just want to make sure that that's a topic that we give focus to and complete that task. I think we started it 2 or 3 years ago, and it got partway done. The consultant left because we weren't participating. At least that's the story I got from the consultant. And now that consultant's not available. And rather than spend time and energy focusing on it myself, I thought this was an opportune time to mention that to Jamal and Barry.
That's a great one, Don, and it is something that is on our radar as well, and something we have been discussing last year and this year. So,
Great,
absolutely.
thank you. Page 26, create an I'm just suggesting that in that interdisciplinary economic development working group, that there is a role for council in some fashion in that. It has to do with maintaining and generating and sustaining revenue. And that's a budget item, which in fact, we do have some interest in, obviously. So I would like to see the council, even one of us or two of us, have some role, maybe at a more higher level, dealing. I'm getting a cramp in my leg, sorry. Anyway, just to have council have a role in that recommended economic development working group, so that council has an ability to express perspective. Thank you. That's all I had. And I too thought it was an excellent work product. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Yes, ma'am.
Ellen, your hand up.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Ellen Burton. Thank you for the great work. I was happy to read through this and kind of go check, 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 check. Interesting, new, check, check, check. Yes, I'm guessing, well, first I want to just add to Dawn's comment regarding community and economic development. One of the organizations that we also belong to is a regional economic development organization called the Columbia River Economic Development Council, CREDC. They've been very effective in working with Flo Borquin, our Director of Community Development, in bringing in some new businesses. So that's also another partnership to further and to consider in this section. Then I do have a few questions. I'm guessing you do a lot of these assessments. You work with many different cities around the country of various sizes. And so I'm curious, what did you expect? First, second, what surprised you? And third, if you were to do this again, what would you change?
I'll go first, and then I'll invite my colleagues to chime in. So, what did we expect? So I will be honest with you and tell you that I purposely go into these engagements with no expectations. And I say that not to be flip, but to be honest about how we approach the work, meaning we want to evaluate each organization on its merits. And so while it is very easy to compare one place to its neighbors or to some other community that I'm sure your residents will compare you to often, we go into these types of assessments really wanting to learn and understand the reasons behind why an organization functions the way it does. Because even though change may be necessary, the reasons why an organization may function the way it does currently may have valid reasons and may have been important for the time. And part of what we're doing is to understand where an organization is today and where it wants to go in the future and what the steps are to help get the organization to that place. You know, I think I have an inherent bias that the people that work in an organization are, I assume, good intent when we go into any organization. We assume that the people that you have, that all of you and that all of your staff are excited about the work they do each day, and they are intentionally trying to make for a better community, just like we know all of you are. And so when we start from that place, it really changes the perspective of our work. So what did I assume? I didn't have any expectations. Again, that may be a cop-out, but it's true. And I'll leave it to the others to say what may have surprised them. I will say the disappointment, or maybe it is a disappointment, what we would do differently. While we all recognize that there is a need to continue to function, despite the fact that we are in the midst of a pandemic, I think the inability to meet face-to-face with staff does have limitations. And if I have a regret, it's a regret I have for every engagement that I've been involved in this past year where it's had to be all virtual, is I do think we lose, while I stand behind the work and I do believe it's quality work and people were very engaged, your staff was very engaged in this process, there is a little something that is lost when you have to do everything virtually. And it's just kind of how I think we all have looked at 2020 in this past year, is it's just, there is some loss associated with that.
I have nothing to add over that. She hit the nail on the head. So.
Right. Thank you. I have a question. This is a great body of work. And as we all know, there's many recommendations. Also, what happens often, unfortunately, with plans of this nature, they get shelved. How would you recommend we move forward with assessing, prioritizing, and implementing these recommendations?
I think that's a great question, and that's a question that so many organizations wrestle with after our work. And I think the organizations that have been successful in follow through and implementation, and there are many of them, they have scheduled dedicated time to discuss the report and the recommendations. And as Jonathan said, I think providing the organization with some grace as the organization wrestles with what are, I forget the actual number, I'll look at my screen, the number of recommendations that are in this report, the organization needs to spend some time digesting and helping to prioritize. And our recommendation is often that the organization be given some time to do that, and then you set a date for them to come back to the council and tell you what the implementation will look like. And then again, you continue to set up regular and routine check-ins, that the implementation conversation becomes part of the culture of the organization. That is really, and that takes diligence, that takes time. And also, as Jonathan said, you know, there's a community that we have worked with in the Northeast, that we did an organizational assessment similar to this, similar sized community, did the organizational assessment. I think now it has been 4 to 5 years ago. And I am still in contact with that city administrator, often because he's calling me asking, hey, we talked about this policy. Do you have a copy of an example that we could use? Because we're still working through it. And of course, the answer is always yes. And we're happy to help. And we don't charge for those phone calls. And but their organization, even 5 years later, still is continuing to talk about the report and the recommendations and implementation. And many of those recommendations have changed because obviously, you know, the conditions within their community have changed over the course of 5 years. But the discipline and the routine of having conversations about continuous improvement has taken hold. That's been a key to their success.
So it sounds like what we're looking at as part of this is a cultural shift. And it could actually be beneficial to be able to set up a conversation with Jamal, our city administrator, and the city administrator or city manager of that organization to learn some best practices or to add on to ones he's already aware of. Because it's great to have that learning, in particular, the sustainability over 5 years. What a great success story.
And just to point out, Ellen, we've already started having some really great conversations in-house with the leadership teams and kind of digging into this and having some, I think, good conversations, just some really good conversations.
Good, thank you for that update.
And I would just add one key point to that. I think the organizations that have not been as successful in implementation, you know, I think there are a lot of things I would imagine in this scan that the department directors and their staff would agree to, and will probably read this and say, well, we were doing that anyway, or we were going to do that anyway. And that's because you have a quality staff and quality organization. What's important for staff to know is that these things are important to the elected officials as well too. And having that perspective also further encourages implementation for the long term.
Any other questions for Michelle or the Ferguson team? Or so the Novak team, sorry.
We're the Ferguson team on this one.
I'd like to say thank you as well. I thought it was it gives us a great starting place to have some really kind of good conversations, and the theme is definitely there. I think collaboration, communication, and clarity. That's the three things as I go through the last two presentations, and especially this one as well, are some key takeaways.